Have you ever heard that death can appear in the form of a baby? A tiny, helpless creature, not even alive yet, but already causing anxiety and fear in adults. On a spring day in 1629, as the sun in Madrid broke through the heavy crimson curtains of the palace, an ominous silence fell upon the Queen's chambers. At that very moment, when the air was still filled with the smell of blood, sweat, and incense, the one who was destined to be called the heir to the Spanish throne was born. And from the very first day, something unnatural was felt about him. In the eastern wing of the royal palace, where the footsteps of servants and the clatter of officers' spurs usually rang out, a gloomy silence reigned. The usual ritual of the royal family proceeded according to plan. Silk sheets, the best court physicians, the aroma of healing oils wafting through the air. But the servants' faces were tense. And in the bedroom itself, Queen Isabella of Bourbon lay exhausted, her face ashen and wet strands of black hair clinging to her forehead. A boy had been born, the long-awaited fifth child of the royal couple, and it seemed like a cause for celebration. But something immediately went wrong. King Philip IV, weary from previous losses, all of his previous children had died before reaching the age of 3, looked anxiously at the newborn. The baby seemed healthy. He cried, breathed, and moved as he should. But there was an unbearable, frightening detail hanging over the whole scene. The child gave off a strange smell. It was unlike incense or birth fluids. It was thick, alien, almost foul, and the smell grew stronger with each passing day. There was nothing physiologically explainable about it, but everyone present immediately had an inner animalistic feeling. It was the smell of death. The servants glanced at each other, trying not to catch the king's eye. The court physicians examined the infant one after another, but found no cause for alarm. The body was normal, the organs were developed, and the reflexes were present. Everything was appropriate for his age, and yet none of the experienced doctors could stay near him for long. The smell coming from the baby caused nausea and a deep, inexplicable revulsion. Soon they began to avoid him, trying not to enter the nursery unnecessarily. Meanwhile, the child had to be prepared for a public presentation before the court nobility. 3 days later, as required by etiquette, an official ceremony was held in the courtyard. The little prince was presented as a healthy and strong heir. He was given the name Carlos Baltasar, in honor of one of the biblical magi and one of the Spanish dukes. Everything looked respectable, solemn, and calm. But behind the scenes, there was turmoil. It intensified especially after rumors reached foreign courts. The French and Austrian ambassadors conveyed ambiguous hints of unrest in the Spanish family in their letters. The Holy Roman Emperor, a relative of the Spanish king, was particularly concerned. It was at his insistence that Dr. Heinrich von Leyden, one of the most respected physicians in the empire, and a man who had studied new European theories about diseases and natural mutations, arrived in Madrid. Together with Don Francisco de Quevedo, the court physician, he conducted a series of examinations. The results only heightened the alarm. Carlos ate well and was active, but his skin remained alarmingly pale, and the foul odor emanating from his body grew stronger. It could not be masked by anything. The infant's entire body seemed to be rejecting life itself. This was particularly frightening for the women who were feeding him. One after another, they complained that they felt sick just from touching him. The doctors looked at each other. Suspicions grew. Von Leyden, who had experience observing rare metabolic diseases, suggested that perhaps there was something in the baby's blood that modern science did not yet understand. In a private note he sent to Vienna, he wrote, "This creature is alive, but there is an unknown substance in its body, and if our world has laws, then this infant seems to be living in defiance of one of them." and in the corridors of the palace, people were already whispering that the infant was cursed, that with his birth, a new era had dawned in the Habsburg dynasty, not one of divine grace but of decay from within. And even if these were just rumors, it was with Carlos Baltasar that a series of events began that would lead to one of the most tragic endings in the history of the Spanish monarchy. Can death be slow? Slow enough that it doesn't kill, but seems to extinguish life from within, slowly and mercilessly? In the palace of King Philip IV, it became clear that something was happening to the infant Carlos Baltasar, and it was beyond the medical understanding of the 17th century. At first, they tried to blame it on illness, then on physical peculiarities, but the truth began to emerge, like a shadow on the sun. It was ancient, frightening, and deeply rooted in the very blood of the royal family. The royal physician Don Francisco de Quevedo leafed through dozens of works, from the writings of Galen to the latest works of the University of Salamanca, all in vain. No chronicle, no medical manuscript described anything like this. Soon he admitted to himself that what was happening to the prince was unprecedented in European medicine. Then all attention turned to Dr. von Leyden, an old Austrian physician known for his observations of the Habsburg descendants. His words were a blow to the fragile confidence of the Spanish court. He had no doubt this was not a disease, it was hereditary. The so-called genetic necrosis, as he called it, manifested itself in the accelerated destruction of tissues and organs. It was as if the body had been half dead since birth. Although outwardly the baby appeared alive and active, his body was slowly decaying, cell by cell. He had seen this form of degeneration before in the Austrian archdukes who had deformed jaws, insanity, and infertility. All this was the result of many years of marriages between close relatives within the Habsburg dynasty. The blood that was supposed to preserve power had turned into poison. Philip could not believe it at first. He was shocked. This was not just a disease of one child. It meant that the entire royal family was rotting from within. But what was even more frightening was that the doctors could offer neither treatment nor salvation. Only relief of symptoms, special baths, diets, exercises. None of these remedies solved the main problem. The prince could live to adulthood, perhaps even rule. But he would forever remain the one who smells of rot. This secret had to remain hidden. Philip ordered immediate silence. Not a word was to leave the narrow circle. A legend was prepared for the court and the people. The prince used rare ceremonial perfumes given to him by Indian chiefs, a symbol of the unity of the crown and the new world. Count Duke Olivares personally took charge of spreading this version, and Dr. von Leyden received an invitation to remain in Madrid on terms that no European court could offer. But while the fate of dynasties was being decided in the heart of the palace, on the other side of the city, just 5 kilometers from the royal residence, a story of a completely different kind was unfolding. In Lavapiés, one of the most densely populated and poorest districts of Madrid, a 17-year-old girl hurried through the narrow streets, clutching a bundle to her chest. Her name was Ana Maria Hernández. She was the daughter of a pharmacist with a good reputation but a modest income. Her father had received an unusual order to prepare an ointment based on exotic plants brought from overseas. Some of the herbs were so rare that he had never heard of them before. The court courier ordered the ointment to be delivered before sunset. The order was generously paid for. Their family had never seen so much money before. Unaware of who the medicine was intended for, Ana Maria ran through the bustling city, not knowing that she was carrying not just an ointment, but part of the royal family's desperate attempt to avert impending disaster. At that moment, she turned a corner and bumped into a group of young nobles, cheerful, smug, laughing. They had no idea that somewhere behind the marble walls of the palace, trouble was brewing that would eventually change the fate of all Spain. It was during those weeks, without a single shot fired or military campaign launched, that the empire over which the sun had once never set began to crumble. Sometimes life hands you something that seems insignificant. A scroll, an errand, a couple of coins. But time passes, and you realize that this was the moment when everything turned upside down. In the spring of 1630, young Ana Maria Hernandez, the daughter of a Madrid pharmacist, carried a bundle of ointment through the city, unaware that it was intended not just for a sick person, but for the very heart of the Spanish monarchy. When she turned onto the square where flatbread was usually baked and street sweets were sold, a young man appeared before her, reserved with an attentive gaze and a slight smile. It was Diego Velázquez, not yet famous, but already recognized at court as a student of the royal painter. He knew Anna. They lived nearby, met at the market, and exchanged a few words. But today, his interest in her intensified. She was clearly in a hurry and was holding something in her hands that she was carefully hiding from prying eyes. He jokingly asked what she was doing in this part of town. Anna tried to laugh it off, saying it was just an errand for her father, nothing special. But Diego was observant. He had long heard strange rumors about the heir to the throne, a 6-month-old baby who, according to the servants, gave off a smell that did not belong to a living creature. The young artist often visited the palace and therefore knew more than he should have. But even he could not have predicted how serious the situation would become. He warned her gently, "Be careful, Anna. Things whispered within the palace walls are rarely safe." She quickened her pace. Her father, a modest apothecary, did not know that his potions had become part of the prince's secret royal treatment program. When she handed the package to a man in an expensive but unassuming doublet at the palace gate, he slipped her a bag of gold without asking any questions. He thanked her and promised they would be in touch. Anna didn't say a word, but inside, she felt a growing sense of unease. Why would the rarest herbs from the New World be needed for a simple baby? The answer came, as it often does, later, and not right away. 6 years passed. Prince Carlos Baltasar turned 6, and contrary to the gloomiest predictions, he was alive. Moreover, against the backdrop of the dynasty's grim history, it was considered almost a miracle. He was thin, with transparent skin through which his veins showed, and a pronounced Habsburg chin, the same one that would remain in portraits centuries later. His dark eyes, too serious for a child, revealed a strange concentration. It was as if he knew more about the world than a child should. The smell, however, did not disappear. It did not go away. And even though the ointments and powders prepared by the Hernandezes and others brought temporary relief, the body continued to emit that same specific, painful aroma. They tried to explain it away with religion, saying it was a sign of being chosen, a symbol of a connection to higher powers. Those around him were forced to accept this version, but the real reason continued to frighten them and remained a closely guarded secret. Court life eventually adjusted. They invented a legend about a divine scent, introduced a ceremony of incense, burning before each of the prince's appearances, and made lavender-scented handkerchiefs fashionable. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone knew. The smell was unbearable. It did not come from his clothes or his skin. It seemed to come from within. The prince could sense it. He was wise beyond his years. He noticed how people avoided him, how servants averted their gaze, how even his teachers took a step back when they spoke to him. He saw their gestures, noticed their handkerchiefs, and understood that the smell he couldn't smell himself was repulsive to others. And he didn't know why, but he knew that there was something inside him that he couldn't escape. It was during these years that a coldness began to grow inside Carlos. Not malice or rage, but an aloof, patient detachment. He didn't cry or complain. He simply began to get used to loneliness. It was as if from birth he had been prepared for a life in which he would always be among people, but never with them. Thus began the rise of the most mysterious prince in Europe, a boy whose name would later become synonymous with the collapse of a great empire. Sometimes the most adult questions are asked by children, not with tears or tantrums, but with a clear gaze and a calm voice. At the age of 5, Carlos Baltasar, sitting on his tiny throne during his morning examination, suddenly asked Dr. von Leyden, "Why do I smell different?" That moment was a turning point. The child did not just sense the attitude of those around him, he understood it, analyzed it. He did not scream, complain, or try to deny it. He waited for the truth. After consulting with the king and Olivares, they decided to tell the prince a simplified version. He had a rare but harmless condition that made him unique. That's what a blessing smells like, they told him. It's part of who he is. Like the color of his eyes or the tone of his voice, neither good nor bad, just part of his nature. Carlos accepted this without question. He didn't ask for explanations or demand medication. He just nodded silently and never brought up the subject again. But something new appeared in his eyes. It was as if he understood that his life was not a personal story, but a cross tied to the crown. On his 6th birthday, his first real court event was held. It was not a balcony or a procession where he waved from afar. It was a step towards real court life. Only the most loyal nobles and their children were selected. Everything had to go perfectly. There could be no chance of an accident. In the morning, he was dressed in blue velvet, a lace collar, and shoes with silver buckles. Maria of Austria, his chief tutor, bustled about him. Carlos remained calm. He had memorized the list of guests, the names of the dukes and their offspring. He knew how to bow to whom and who was related to whom. When Maria adjusted his collar, he suddenly asked, "What if they don't like me?" It was an unexpected, poignant phrase. Maria, as befitted a lady of the court, replied without hesitation, "You are the Prince of Spain, the future king of the greatest empire. It is not a matter of liking. It's about respect." He nodded, but his eyes showed that he understood that this was an evasive answer. He knew that the truth was hidden behind the whispers. He felt the servants retreat slightly, even his beloved teachers holding their breath. And yet he continued to stand straight, because royal discipline already lived in his 6-year-old soul. Even Dr. von Leyden, who had been watching him since birth, was amazed. His condition had not worsened over the past year. That meant there was still hope. The throne room was being prepared for a celebration as if ambassadors from the Vatican were arriving. Fresh flowers were in every niche, fragrant candles. All the windows were wide open. The air had to be filled with incense to drown out what could not be defeated. Everything was calculated: the rhythm, the lighting, the distance between people. The prince had to move along a strictly designated route, greeting, bowing, exchanging phrases, and not a single touch. When Carlos entered, all the guests stood up. His steps were measured and confident. He knew he had to be dignified. Among the guests was Ana Maria Hernandez, now a 23-year-old court assistant to Dr. von Leyden. Her life had changed in recent years. After her father's death, she had taken over the apothecary's workshop and become the prince's personal developer of medicinal ointments and tinctures. She was respected at court. She was taken seriously. But more importantly, she had become attached to Carlos. She was not frightened by his smell, nor was she embarrassed by his aloofness. She saw in him a living, feeling boy who had been dealt an impossible fate. His seriousness, his refinement, his fragile but unyielding composure evoked an almost maternal warmth in her. That day, standing among the courtiers, she looked at him with her heart in her throat. There was something poignant and deeply dignified beyond his years in the way he held his head and bowed, According to protocol, each nobleman had to introduce his son to the heir, but he greeted him with a brief nod. Carlos did everything perfectly. The hall was silent. Even the most caustic aristocrats, accustomed to backroom gossip, did not dare to speak this time. Because at that moment it became clear the child who was secretly called cursed was behaving as if he were already king. Everything was going according to plan. Every element of the celebration had been carefully planned. The flowers were arranged so that their scent would mask the heir's body odor. The windows were thrown open to let in fresh air, and candles gave off the rare scent of oriental incense. The air in the throne room was thick with tense reverence. The guests smiled, bowed, and kept their distance. Everything proceeded with almost deadly precision until one child disrupted the script. The 7-year-old son of one of the dukes, a boy with a capricious temper and arrogant manners, loudly uttered an insult, comparing the smell coming from the air to the smell of tombs. A dead silence hung in the hall. The boy's father turned pale and clutched his son's shoulder convulsively. Some courtiers recoiled, others froze, not knowing where to look. But the heir did not show a shadow of embarrassment. He simply looked at his offender with an impassive face and replied in such a way that everyone fell silent. The words, spoken loudly and clearly, struck those present. He did not justify himself or attack in return. He exalted his lineage, reminding them of the ancestral mission that rested on his shoulders. And this was not an act of childish bravado, but the deed of a man already living within the confines of his future crown. Those who had previously treated him with caution now looked at him differently. The fear in their eyes was replaced by respect. Discussion of this scene filled the palace corridors that evening. Everyone agreed. The child had a dignity that could only be envied. Later, as the evening drew to a close, he returned to his chambers, where, as usual, a bath awaited him. Fragrant salts, prepared according to a special recipe, lay on a tray. Anna Maria, as always, had personally supervised everything. Since she had replaced her father in the apothecary's service, her role in court life had changed. Now she did not just prepare potions. She had become a personal assistant in his treatment, selecting formulas with precision and reverent responsibility. Over the years, her attitude toward the heir had become personal. He did not inspire pity, but deep respect. No child carried such an obvious burden. Even those who had come to regard him as strange now noted his intelligence, composure, and strength of character. Her observations convinced her of one thing: he was not just an heir. He was a fortress unto himself. That evening, when the bath was ready, he asked a question. Simple, childish, but with a frightening seriousness. Its meaning was clear. He knew more about himself than anyone was willing to admit. And although she tried to answer gently, avoiding the absolute truth, he sensed every omission. He wasn't looking for pity. He was looking for knowledge. He needed clarity, not to calm himself, but to prepare. Because, as he would later say, ignorance is a luxury that a king cannot afford, even if it reeks of death. After that scene, she understood. She couldn't wait any longer. An inner decision that had been maturing for a long time had now become clear. She would search. In ancient medical compendiums, in monastery recipes, from traveling healers, from herbalists, whom the church feared and despised, not for the sake of the court, not for the sake of the empire, for him, for the child who had understood too early what the fear of those around him smelled like. At the same time, 1,000 kilometers from Madrid, in the Holy Roman Empire, another member of the same dynasty was experiencing his own crisis. One of the emperor's brothers was suffering from increasingly frequent bouts of madness. During a brief flash of lucidity, he dictated a letter. It was addressed to the Spanish king. It contained lines that would be discussed in diplomatic circles for a long time to come. He wrote, "I have learned of the condition of the young heir." The letter, sent from Vienna, arrived in Madrid at the height of the turmoil. It contained lines that not only violated protocol, but blurred the boundaries between religion, science, and the forbidden. The author of the letter, a high-ranking member of the Habsburg family suffering from progressive insanity, claimed to have found ancient texts describing a ritual capable of stopping the internal decay, afflicting the descendants of the dynasty. He referred to old Eastern European practices that were not recognized by the Church, but, according to him, brought relief. His words were alarming. Blood calls for blood. Life can renew what death has already begun to destroy. He sent the papers with a trusted person, carefully concealing their contents under a veil of Christian symbolism, so that they would not be immediately burned in the monastery scriptoria. But in reality, these were texts that, if intercepted by the Inquisition, would have led to interrogations, bonfires, and accusations of heresy. At the same time, the worst was happening in Madrid. Despite all efforts, the heir's condition deteriorated sharply. His smell became unbearable. Even the usual ointments did not help. In addition, he developed a fever that could not be brought down by herbs or compresses. For the first time in 6 years, the court physician, Dr. von Leyden, admitted his helplessness. He could not explain the cause, could not find a cure, and worst of all, began to fear the worst. The threat of losing his heir became real. In desperation, the king broke all conventions. He summoned a female pharmacist, a woman, a commoner. She was allowed into the monarch's private chambers, an unheard-of occurrence at the Spanish court. He showed her the papers from Vienna and asked for only one thing: to save his son. Not as a king, but as a father. He could not officially acknowledge these methods, but he made it clear that if there was a chance, he was willing to do anything. The responsibility was hers. The support was his. But everything had to be done in secret. The Inquisition was watching every move. That same night, she locked herself in her laboratory in the palace. Outside, the torches were dying, and inside, work began that was unprecedented in the history of Spanish medicine. The texts sent from Vienna were a mixture of Eastern European cults and folk medicine, generously seasoned with symbols of blood and purification. The main idea was that the fresh blood of a person not connected to the cursed dynasty could rewrite the decaying code inside the patient. Many of the ritual details horrified her. Circles, incantations, appeals to ancient forces. She discarded everything that made no sense. She was not a witch. She was a scientist, the daughter of an apothecary, raised among formulas, test tubes, and Latin treatises. Her approach was rational. From all this frightening mixture, she extracted the essence, the idea of transfusing blood mixed with certain herbs. It sounded risky, but not impossible. For the first time, she realized that she was now responsible for more than just the boy's health. The fate of a dynasty depended on her decision. A mistake could cost her not only her reputation, but her life. But if she was right, she could stop not just the disease, but the very curse that had hung over the Habsburgs for generations. She made a list of the necessary ingredients. She needed a donor, young, healthy, with no blood ties to the dynasty. Rare herbs were required to stimulate blood production and purify the fluid of toxins. Everything had to be gathered in secret. And everything had to be ready by morning, because there was no time to waste. There were only two possible outcomes. Either the curse would be stopped, or it would take away what the king had tried so hard to preserve. The fate of the child who had smelled of death from the first moments of his life now lay, at least in part, in the hands of a woman who had once been an unknown apothecary's daughter. The day chosen for the decisive step was not accidental. The moonlight did not penetrate the clouds, and the courtyard was almost empty. Most of the nobility had left for a solemn ceremony at the monastery. It was in this emptiness, on the border between darkness and silence, that an act unprecedented in the history of the Spanish crown was being prepared. A modest room was chosen for the procedure, a small room adjacent to the heir's chambers. There, on an oak table covered with a white cloth, stood glass vessels with infusions, ceramic bowls, and silver knives, carefully polished to a shine. According to Viennese records, this metal was considered to distort the properties of blood the least. Everything was prepared down to the smallest detail, and each of them could be the last. Not only the health of the heir depended on precision, but perhaps his very life. Dr. von Leyden, who had not left the child's side in the last few days, watched the preparations with a stern expression on his face. He hesitated for a long time before agreeing to participate. His duty as a doctor conflicted with his duty as a Catholic. But seeing how rapidly the child was weakening, he abandoned his dogma. Now he stood nearby in the shadow of the lamp and whispered, "Are you sure about this?" The answer was calm. No. There was no certainty. But logic and intuition told him that the path he had chosen was the only one possible. Everything associated with pagan practices was removed from the old rituals. Only the pure medical essence remained, the transfusion of purified blood. A donor was found. He was young, healthy, and not related to the Habsburgs. When there was a quiet knock at the door, the tension in the room became almost palpable. The door opened and a tall man with a tired face and a wide-brimmed hat entered the room. It was the same man who had recently been painting portraits of the nobility. An artist respected at court for his subtle understanding of human nature. He already knew what he was getting himself into. His blood could be the bridge between life and death. The young donor approached, listening to the instructions without fear. The explanation of the procedure sounded clear and businesslike. Blood would be drawn, mixed with extracts, and applied to the heir's skin through a superficial wound. The whole process was to take only a few minutes. The main thing was to prevent clotting. Everything looked like a serious medical procedure, but there was something else in the air, a sense that they were crossing a line. At that very moment when everything was ready, he appeared in the room. He was sick, his forehead burning, wearing a light nightgown, his eyes tired but alive. He stood in the doorway as if sensing that this was not just about treatment. His presence did not frighten anyone, but it stunned everyone. He was witness to his own fate. His body trembled, but his voice was confident. He wanted to know what they were going to do to him. They did not lie to him. They did not lull him with sweet fairy tales. They simply explained that this was a new attempt, unlike the previous ones. Perhaps it would not work. Perhaps it would. But there was no other option. He listened without interrupting and nodded, not out of obedience, out of understanding. From that moment on, everything that happened became part of a single, terrible, and grand plan. Between life and death, between dynasty and curse, between faith and forbidden knowledge. Spain did not yet know that night that its history had reached a point of no return. No one knew if it would work. Everything that happened that night was not a cure in the usual sense, but a daring attempt to cross the boundaries of what was permissible, to combine science, tradition, faith, and risk. And all this for a boy who had smelled of decay since birth. The procedure began at midnight. The air in the small room was filled with the smells of herbs, heated metal, and wax. Everything was ready. Instruments, glass vessels with infusions, a ceramic bowl to collect the blood. Next to him was the man who had agreed to be the donor, a young, strong, pure-blooded Spaniard, untouched by the hereditary diseases of the Habsburgs. He had not come for the title or the reward. He had come because he felt he had to. The heir to the dynasty sat in a chair supported by pillows. The fever had subsided a little, and despite his weakness, he was calm and focused. He watched the preparations for the procedure without fear or fuss. His calmness frightened even the adults. He understood what was happening. He understood that his body was not just sick. It was dying. And now a stranger would give part of himself to try to stop this destruction. First there was blood. A small amount was taken from the donor, quickly, carefully. It was mixed with infusions, exactly according to the recipes found in the Viennese documents. The mixture thickened slightly, took on a rich hue, and at some point even the smell changed. Instead of the usual metallic aroma, something else appeared, strangely warm and rich. It could have been a coincidence, or it could have been the effect of the herbs, but the feeling was clear. There was now something more than just blood in this vessel. The heir did not ask any unnecessary questions. He simply held out his hand, without flinching, without biting his lip. He knew it had to be done, and everyone in the room felt how this simple readiness outweighed all fear, all risks and doubts. Even the experienced doctor, always skeptical and cold, lowered his gaze, not out of fatigue, but out of respect. The incision was small. Blood appeared in a thin stream. The mixture, pre-warmed, was applied directly to the skin. It darkened in the air and was absorbed. The blood joined together, one foreign, alive, and one familiar, tired and distorted. Then came the wait. The room was plunged into tense silence. The doctor watched. The donor, having bandaged the wound, sat motionless as if afraid to disturb the process. The woman who had organized everything washed the instruments to distract herself from her thoughts, from the fear that her audacity could result in accusations of witchcraft. An hour passed, then another. The heir fell asleep, deeply, peacefully. No signs of pain, no convulsions, no feverish delirium, just sleep. And that was already a miracle, the first in many years. The night when everything was to be decided was silent and moonless. In an empty palace hidden from the eyes of the nobility, something was happening that under other circumstances would have been considered heresy. But now it was a desperate chance. After the ritual that joined the blood of the donor and the heir, the room was plunged into a waiting silence. The air was heavy as before a storm. The woman did not leave the bed. The doctor monitored his pulse and breathing. Everything was stable. The boy slept deeply and evenly, as if for the first time in many years his body had allowed itself to rest. An hour passed, then another. The horizon was beginning to lighten outside the window when something happened that no one dared to hope for. The heir opened his eyes. There was no pain, no fever, no familiar cloudy detachment. It was a lively, clear gaze. He sat up and said he wanted to eat. It was a miracle. The fever was gone. His skin warmed up, and the smell, the same one that had hung over him since infancy like a brand, almost disappeared. It did not disappear completely, but now it could be easily concealed with ordinary perfumes. Those who were nearby did not immediately realize what had happened. Only after a few days did it become clear. For the first time in his life, the heir felt alive. Rumors spread quickly, although there was no official ceremony. The king was informed immediately. He listened to the report in complete silence, then ordered a private audience. The woman, once a simple apothecary's daughter, entered the royal chambers as a person of honor to the heir. A new position was created for her. Her name was heard for the first time in court circles, not as the name of a servant, but as the name of the one who had saved the heir. The monarch listened to everything to the end, then nodded slowly. He understood the main thing. The treatment was not permanent. A month later, the effect began to weaken. The smell returned, faint but noticeable. This meant that the procedure would have to be repeated, constantly, and that meant that the woman would remain at court. To protect her from gossip, she was given a title, the lowest but sufficient. It referred to the district where she was born and became a symbol not of her origin, but of her merit. It was an unprecedented step. The courtiers were surprised, whispered and murmured, but no one dared to challenge it. Because the result was obvious? The heir reappeared in public, lively, straightforward, composed. No one could forget what he had been like just a month ago and what he had become now. It is important to note that at the same time in Europe, debates continued about the admissibility of blood transfusion, both as a medical procedure and as a moral phenomenon. It was not until 1667 that Frenchman Jean-Baptiste Denis performed the first officially documented transfusion between humans. Everything that happened in Madrid was more than 30 years ahead of its time, and so dangerous that not a single record of it was left behind. The woman who had defied nature now lived under guard, with a title and privileges, but she knew that her role was not over. After all, the heir still needed her. Even the king, reserved as always, once allowed himself to say that the boy asked about her more often than about his own teachers. Years passed. The ritual, once begun as a desperate experiment, became something familiar, a ritual ingrained in the very fabric of the royal palace. It was repeated monthly with minimal variations, and each time it produced the same result. The smell that had once haunted the air receded. His physical condition stabilized. His fatigue disappeared. He slept deeply. The fever never returned. His body, once poisoned from within, seemed to have learned to live again. During this time, a special bond developed between the boy and the woman who had saved him. She was no longer just a supplier of potions. He called her when he wanted to know something about herbs, asked her to explain why flowers smell, why bark is boiled, where infusions come from. He waited for her to bring new books and read stories to him about doctors, wandering botanists, myths, and animals that had never been to Spain. She became someone he didn't usually have in his life as a prince, someone he didn't have to pretend in front of. Officially, the heir had a mother, but she, like most queens, kept her distance. Formality, coldness. He needed warmth. And so he gravitated toward those who did not see him as a symbol, but saw him as a child, especially in those moments when the treatment was exhausting, and after the procedures, he asked her to stay for a while, just to sit, just to be silent. The king saw everything. And one day he said, "When the boy becomes a man and learns the truth about himself, he must have those who were with him during his most vulnerable years by his side." This hint needed no explanation. The woman understood. She had become more than just an assistant. She was now part of the inner circle, that rare group of people who would protect the throne until he was strong enough. Time passed. The donor remained the same man who had once painted a portrait of the king on horseback now gave blood every month, and at the same time taught the heir to draw. The boy showed talent, a delicate hand, a keen eye, attention to detail. The procedures were no longer accompanied by fear, but by patient routine. The doctor kept detailed records, refined the proportions, and noted improvements. By the time the heir turned 10, the old fears were forgotten. The court adapted. Some believed that the child had simply outgrown the disease. Some praised the doctor for his wisely chosen diet. Only a few knew the truth. The rest were satisfied with the outward results. The heir was alive, alert, and intelligent. He was no longer seen as a weak link, but as a future ruler. But the stability was suddenly interrupted. One visit changed everything. The Austrian Archduke arrived at the palace, the very same whose ancient records form the basis of the ritual. He requested a private audience. He was given a special chamber where only the king, the heir, and 2 doctors were allowed. The Archduke looked closely at the boy. There was no curiosity in his gaze, but something closer to hunger. He studied him as one would look at the long-awaited result of an experiment. Then the words were spoken. The blood had worked. The color of his face changed. The smell almost disappeared. He congratulated the king, not as a vassal, but as a kinsman, as the keeper of a shared secret. When the conversation turned to the procedure itself, he turned to the woman. He said he was impressed, especially by the fact that she, a simple apothecary, had been able to adapt his texts. But he immediately expressed his doubts. He suspected that important elements had been removed. The answer was restrained. Only what had a logical basis had been left from the ritual part. The rest was superstition. His smile was icy. He said that rituals were the language in which humanity spoke to forces that existed long before churches and universities. A heavy silence hung in the room. The doctor hastened to turn the conversation to medicine. The boy's condition was stable, his development was age-appropriate, and his intelligence was even above average. But it was already clear that the meeting with his Austrian relative had not passed without a trace. He had not come just to look. He had come to remind them who possessed the knowledge and who was ready to take it back, along with everything it concealed. The mechanism that had been working in the shadows for many years began to malfunction. Previously, everything had seemed to be going well. Treatment was repeated according to schedule. Symptoms were subsiding, and the smell had almost disappeared. The courtyard had forgotten that the heir had once been considered doomed. But a sudden visit from an Austrian relative disrupted this fragile balance. He arrived with politeness and familial affection, but his eyes told a different story. He watched the boy not as a child, but as a vessel, an object. And this did not escape those around him. He asked a direct and disturbing question. Was the same donor still being used? The answer was yes. The artist, whose blood had been effective from the start, remained a constant source. But the reaction to this was unexpected. The Austrian guest stated bluntly that this was a mistake. Blood, he said, adapts. It stops working. Rotation is necessary. A stronger source must be found. The boy listened without interfering. But then, unexpectedly, he broke the silence. He confessed that the artist's blood made him strong. It was not said as a protest, but as a statement of fact. He felt the blood's influence. He felt the difference. And it wasn't imagination. It was bodily knowledge. The Austrian relative nodded, but there was something else in his words. He spoke of life force, of creative energy, but the hint was clear. Over time, something more would be needed, something stronger, something purer. The woman felt a chill run down her spine. His words, his gaze, there was something about him that couldn't be dismissed as mere eccentricity. It was a threat, wrapped in formality but too clear to ignore. Later that night, someone broke into her laboratory, without warning. He came alone, without security, only with a silent servant at the door. He broke all protocols. He addressed her by her title, as if to emphasize that she was now part of a circle where such visits were permissible. He began with praise. He seemed to admire her work. But very quickly, the conversation took a different turn. He accused her of deliberately omitting essential elements of the ritual. He claimed that only the symptoms had been suppressed. The disease remained dormant, untouched, and in his opinion, it could not be destroyed with herbs and tinctures. The proposal was made quietly, almost tenderly. He spoke of other blood, special blood, blood that cannot be taken from adults. He was talking about a child voluntarily given up for gold, for a title, for the promise of prosperity. He said it had been done before. It had been done for the sake of great dynasties. He did not speak of violence. He spoke of necessity, of a lesser evil. At that moment, the woman felt true horror for the first time, not of the rituals, not of the risk, but of how easily a person could pass off a sacrifice as a blessing. He spoke with conviction, with the confidence of someone who had already done such a thing. She refused, clearly, without hesitation. She said she would never agree, that the king would never allow it. But in response, she heard not a threat, a question, simple, cold. Was she sure? And before she could answer, the door flew open. The artist entered, pale but determined. Behind him were 2 guards. Everything that happened next was left unsaid. There was no need for explanations. The order had been given in advance, and although no one uttered a word of accusation that evening, the actions spoke for themselves. She was being protected. He was being taken away. After the Austrian guest left her laboratory, the woman remained alone among the vessels, infusions, and cooled metal. She had not yet recovered when the door opened again. The donor entered, the very same man who had donated his blood for so many years to save the heir. Behind him was the royal guard. He uttered a short phrase. The monarch summoned the guest immediately. Everything was said formally, but his voice betrayed his tension. The Austrian left without showing any irritation or fear, but his escort clearly resembled a convoy rather than an honor guard. After he left, the artist approached her. He didn't need to ask anything. It was obvious. The woman's hands were shaking. She was barely holding back her anger and disgust. He explained that the heir himself had realized that the words spoken during the audience concealed something dangerous. He did not understand everything, but enough to be alarmed. He had run for help himself. This news shocked the woman. While the adults tried to protect the child, he protected her. His actions put everything in its place. Now there was no doubt about the kind of person they were dealing with. And that is why, without wasting any time, she decided that she must speak to the king immediately. They did not delay. The monarch was already aware of the situation. That same night, the Austrian was escorted from the palace without any official mention. But the expression on the king's face, his brief look of gratitude, said it all. He knew what had happened. He appreciated it, and he made his choice. Everything seemed to return to normal. The boy grew up. His treatment continued. The ritual became part of the palace routine, attracting little attention. 2 years later, he turned 12. The smell had finally become faint, almost imperceptible. He studied, trained, and held himself confidently in the hall where official receptions were held. But it was at this moment that a new threat arose. Gradual, quiet, but real. The one who had been the main donor for so many years began to weaken. It was not critical, but the doctor noted the changes. Constant blood loss, albeit moderate, began to take its toll. And then the question arose, who would be next? The right candidate had to meet a number of conditions: good health, no ties to the dynasty, complete loyalty, and at some point the answer became obvious, too obvious to ignore. The woman who had been involved in the treatment from the beginning understood that the choice might fall on her. When she said it out loud, the doctor was not surprised. He had already thought about it. She met all the criteria, but he warned her immediately that it was not the medical consequences that could become a real problem, but the court intrigues. Even now, her position was the subject of gossip. A woman living in the palace, unmarried, constantly close to the heir. If she now became a blood donor, it would bind them so closely together that rumors could turn into accusations. But the decision had been made. The boy's health was more important. She spoke to the king personally. After listening, he simply nodded. He had long since stopped paying attention to gossip. Only one thing mattered to him: the result. And if the doctor gave the go-ahead, then there were no objections. Thus began a new chapter. In a scheme that had once been a challenge of the times, a new line had now appeared, one that would make the woman not just a healer, but part of the heir's own body. The blood of Ana Maria and the blood of Velázquez now flowed through Carlos's veins. These transfusions, once begun as a necessary measure, had become a source of strength, almost a new form of existence. With each passing month, the heir felt stronger. The combined donations, with Velázquez remaining the primary donor and Ana Maria providing stability during his recovery, unexpectedly had an effect that exceeded all expectations. Carlos's body was no longer fighting. It was flourishing. By the age of 12, the young Habsburg no longer resembled a child but a young adult. The fragile physicality of childhood had disappeared. What remained was a slender, almost aristocratic thinness, but his movements and voice had gained confidence. His gaze revealed a self-awareness rarely seen even in adults. Carlos retained his outward reserve, the very cold composure that had formed in him from an early age. But beneath this ice lay a relentless thirst for knowledge, for the world, for understanding his own self. He immersed himself in his studies. Painting, in which Velázquez himself was his mentor, ceased to be just a pastime. It became a means of expression. Studying botany and natural medicine with Ana Maria became a passion. His notebooks were filled with notes that rivaled professional works in their accuracy. He knew the smell of herbs, remembered their properties, and increasingly asked questions that were increasingly difficult to answer evasively. With each passing year, the three of them grew closer. In private conversations, Carlos referred to Ana Maria and Velázquez as his real family. These were not just the words of a boy longing for warmth. It was a confession. His relatives, the king and queen, always remained at a distance, measured by ceremony. But these two lived nearby, knew his weaknesses, saw him in moments of pain and helplessness. He trusted them more than anyone else. One day, while Ana Maria was preparing another infusion, Carlos entered the laboratory without knocking, as he always did. He sat down opposite her and asked an unexpected, disturbing question. Are we really who we think we are? There was no childishness in his words, only doubt, only observation. He talked about blood, about how it carries not only nourishment, but something more, about how the blood of strangers was in his body. And could that mean that he was now part of them? He spoke calmly, but behind the calmness, there was a shift. He began to wonder, was he still himself? Ana Maria tried to answer scientifically. She said that blood is a carrier of oxygen and substances, but not souls, not personalities. He listened, but he didn't accept it. He reminded her that he used to smell like death. Now he didn't. That meant he had changed, didn't it? And she admitted that he had. Physiologically, yes, the treatment had worked. But his essence, what made him Carlos Balthazar Habsburg, remained, or at least it should have. But Carlos went further. He said he had dreams about workshops he had never been to, gardens where grasses grew whose names he knew but had never studied. These images were too clear to be fantasy. He spoke about it without hysteria, as if it were a fact. Ana Maria was silent. She remembered those very lines in the Viennese documents that spoke of a possible transfer of essential traces. At the time, she dismissed it as ritualistic nonsense. Now she couldn't. After all, everything that had seemed impossible had once become her job. She tried to explain. Dreams are just a web of impressions. The mind collects images, smells, words, and creates illusions. But Carlos didn't accept that. He looked at her intently, almost harshly, and said, "You didn't answer my question." He didn't just ask the question out loud. He seemed to be testing the limits of what was permissible. Was he now really partly made up of Ana Maria and Velázquez? Not just his body, but something more. His very being? There was no irony in his voice, only a thirst to understand. If someone else's blood had been flowing through his veins for so many years, could he say that he had become part of those who had shared it with him? Ana Maria held his gaze. She didn't look away or hide behind medical jargon. The answer was simple. Yes, a special bond had formed between them, not because he had become less himself, but because they had invested their lives in him, and that life now lived on through him. Carlos nodded. For the first time in the entire conversation, a slight, almost childlike smile appeared on his face. His answer sounded calm, but behind it lay an inner pain that could not be cured by potions, herbs, or even blood. He knew that one day when he became king, he would be alone. He knew that he would be surrounded only by obeisance, courtly phrases, and flowery pretense. But deep down, he wanted to be sure that someone would remain by his side. Someone real. Ana Maria couldn't keep quiet. She took his hand, surprising even herself. It was a sincere gesture, not a courtly one. She said something that was not required by etiquette or protocol. He would never be alone. As long as he needed them, she and Velázquez would be there for him, not as subjects, as those who truly knew who he was. Carlos smiled again, and this smile was different, real, pure, the kind that only comes from those who have gained trust. He said that this was the only thing in this world of masks and lies that he was completely sure of. Not the crown, not the title, not the pedigree, but this connection. For Ana Maria, this moment was not just important. It was a turning point. Everything that had come before, the ointments, the mixtures, the procedures, now faded into the background. The treatment that had begun to save her body had grown into something much greater. It had created a bond, a fabric that united three people who had transcended roles and classes. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't blind loyalty. It was recognition, a shared destiny, a shared responsibility, a shared path. And that path no longer belonged only to Carlos. It touched everyone around him. But what no one could know at that moment was that all of this would soon be threatened. The bond, so fragile and yet so strong, would be put to the test, a test that even the darkest chapters of the Viennese manuscripts could not prepare them for.